Harner, who is a, how are we doing? Michael Harner, who is a well-known anthropologist, but also somebody who experienced initiation when he was doing field work in the Amazon. It involved ayahuasca and datura, a mixture. He wrote a book called The Way of the Shaman. And in the preface, he wrote something very interesting. He said that from his dual perspective of a Western-trained academician and also somebody who personally experienced the shamanic initiation, that Western psychology and psychiatry is seriously biased in at least two significant ways. The first bias he calls the ethnocentric bias. You see, we have certain kind of perspective on the psyche and what is normal, what isn't normal. And we consider that perspective to be absolutely superior to any human group that has ever existed. We have it really together. All these other cultures are primitive. They are sort of uneducated. What they are doing has no basis. When I had talked with Michael, for example, about the Middle Eastern war in the past, you know, there was a situation, 200,000 people, you know, killed in a way that looked like a sort of computer game. 600 oil wells deliberately ignited, oil spills, deliberate oil spills into the Persian Gulf, killing the life for the next 20 years. We all watch it on the television. It's just another day in the Western civilization. If somebody has a past life experience, we think we should put them away and put them on tranquilizers. So this is what Michael calls ethnocentric. Different cultural groups have different concepts of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Now the second bias that he talks about is more interesting from the perspective of my talk. He calls it cognicentric. A probably better term is pragmacentric, which means we have created the theories in psychology and psychiatry on the basis of observations from ordinary states and experiences from non-ordinary states of consciousness. We have systematically excluded somehow from scrutiny, from systematic scrutiny, anything that comes from the study of these experiences that I call holotropic. I'm not talking just about psychedelic literature, where a lot of things were published that were ignored by the mainstream circles. But things coming from field anthropology, things coming from experiential psychotherapy, and from thanatology. I will give you just that example from thanatology. It's well known today that you can be in a state of near death. You have a near-death experience, let's say cardiac arrest, and your consciousness leaves the body while you're being resuscitated. Consciousness moves in the room, maintaining the perceptual capacity, can watch the whole procedure from the ceiling, can decide to go and check what's happening in other rooms of the same building, going through walls, can experience something that's happening 200 miles away. And if the person is brought back to life and you talk with them, you get the report, you can then go and check and you'll find out that you get consensual validation that those things were actually happening. The last study was very interesting. Ken Ring studied a group of people congenitally blind who at the time when they had near-death experience, they could see for the first time in their life. And he was particularly interested in what he calls veridical out-of-body experiences, where they not only saw something, but what they saw, again, could be consensually validated. Now, this is a major paradigm challenge. I mean, the modern physicists needed much less to move from Newtonian physics to quantum relativistic physics. So if you work with non-ordinary states, you will see many things like this. I just give it as one example, but we see many of those kinds of things that should not be happening if the way we are describing the relationship between the brain and consciousness is really accurate. Okay, so I will just show you in which areas I believe we would have to change somehow our belief system in order to accommodate these experiences. Am I doing something wrong? It's coming, yeah? Okay. So this is the list that I have in my book of areas of belief that we have, you know, at least the official kind of a party line in psychology and psychiatry that are seriously challenged by the observations from non-ordinary states. The first one is the cartography of the psyche. We have. Is there any way I can at least see people a little? So we have a cartography of the psyche that's limited to postnatal biography and to the Freudian individual unconscious. If you work with non-ordinary states, people's experiences will not stay within that playground. So when I tried to, after years of research, I tried to map somehow the experiences that were common in psychedelic sessions, I had to vastly expand that cartography and include two domains. The first of them I call perinatal, because many people in non-ordinary states are actually reliving their birth, and they get access to prenatal kind of experiences. Now, it's extraordinary, if you think about it, that we don't think generally about birth as being a psychotrauma, something that could last 20, 30, 40 hours. The child can be born half dead or dead and has to be resuscitated. This is not considered to be a psychotrauma, but we put tremendous emphasis on the immediately following experience of nursing, good breast, bad breast, you know, good mother, good nipple, evil nipple, wrong nipple, and so on. So if the child didn't notice that something strange was happening when he or she was being born, it will take a very long time before they can sort of distinguish nuances in nursing. And this kind of work shows you that there is a powerful imprint of the birth process. So the perinatal area has to be added. And then there is a vast realm beyond that, which we now call transpersonal. Some of the experiences I mentioned, we can identify with other people, we can experience group consciousness, we can experience identification with animal forms where new information is coming in, identification with nature. We can transcend linear time, we can have experiences from the lives of our ancestors. There's a whole important category of karmic experiences. Ancestral experiences, the collective unconscious in the historical sense, the way Jung described it. But there's also access there to the archetypal, to the mythological dimension of the collective unconscious. We can experience deities from different cultures, again, whether or not we know this mythology. So the cartography has to be vastly expanded. Now, in terms of the understanding of emotional and psychosomatic disorders, which are not organic, which are what we call functional or psychogenic, again, the general understanding is that you can fully explain them from postnatal events. What happened in infancy, what happened in childhood, and what happened later in life. This whole sort of Freudian idea of the oral, anal, urethral, and so on, phallic. Early cannibalism, you know, Electra complex. This should be somehow conceptual equipment that fully accounts for what we see as functional and psychogenic disorders. If you work with non-ordinary states, with people who have these problems, you always get something significant from childhood and infancy that seems to give an explanation, but it is not a full story. Then you find out that the same problem has deeper roots on the perinatal and then typically even into the transpersonal. So let's say you can work with somebody who has psychogenic asthma. In the holotropic breathwork, the holotropic breathwork would intensify the choking. There would be choking And then the first experience that comes connected with the choking would be, let's say, near drowning when the person was 7. Then it continues, goes deeper. It becomes a series of episodes when the older brother was choking that person. Then it goes to whooping cough. Then a deeper layer would be choking in the birth canal. And then you can get a past life experience of being hanged or being strangled. So there is a whole, what I call a coex system, a system of condensed experience. So if we get the biographical part of the story, it seems to make sense, but it would not be the whole story. It would not have the kind of therapeutic impact that we would expect, because there is much more underneath. So we would have an expanded view of what is the material underlying a typical emotional or psychosomatic problem. Now, this looks like very bad news. There's much more there than we thought. But the good news is that you also find new, very powerful, effective mechanisms of healing in non-ordinary states. Let's say reliving birth and integrating that experience can be extremely healing and transformative. I have seen powerful healing happening in connection with past life experience. Again, whatever we think about reincarnation, the past life experience as a phenomenon is a very real thing, however we decide to interpret it. I have seen situations where the healing happens when a powerful archetype, Jungian archetype, is allowed to surface into consciousness. Powerful healing can happen when people have experience of cosmic unity, sort of oneness, dissolving of boundaries, and so on. So we find many new effective therapeutic mechanisms. Then we have the strategy of psychotherapy. Now, if you think about it, we have enormous number of schools of psychotherapy, and they have fundamental disagreement as to how the psyche functions, what are the major motivating forces in the psyche, why symptoms develop, what the symptoms mean, and each therapeutic school gives you a different technique that we use to work with the client. So if I'm a beginning psychiatrist, I look at the market, and then one school starts talking to me. Like for me, it was Freud. Wow, this is where it's at. And then if we are there for a while and it doesn't work for us, we get a training in another school, and there could be a fundamental disagreement between those schools. Now, this cannot be an important factor, because if the conceptual understanding would be a major factor, then one school would have to be closest to truth, and that school would have to get most of the therapeutic results. But the studies that were done show that the therapeutic results are almost equally distributed, and each school has good therapists and bad therapists. And it doesn't seem to have a lot of convincing relationship with what the theoretical concept is, what we think we are doing. So some of the studies emphasize that maybe what's important in psychotherapy is the quality of the human encounter between the therapist and the client, or the feeling of the client of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, sometimes for the first time in their life. And the kind of interpretation that we give cannot be the significant part, because that would vary. The interpretation of the same material would vary from school to school. I usually remember something from my own psychoanalysis. I had a psychoanalyst who was a kind of elderly gentleman. He was elderly, he was my age now. And he was, as I mentioned, he was really convinced Freudian. And several of us of the same age were in analysis with him, and once in a while he would fall asleep in analysis, and we would have to do something to try to bring him back into the process. And then besides having our own training, we also had seminars where we could ask questions. And so on one occasion, one of us asked a purely theoretical question: what happens when a psychoanalyst falls asleep? If I continue free associating, does therapy still continue? Is this an interruption of the therapeutic process? Should I get refunded for the period of time when the analyst is dozing off? And so he had to answer it. He couldn't say it wouldn't happen because he knew we knew, so he had to come up with an interpretation of some kind. So he said, yeah, that happens. Sometimes you're kind of tired or recovering from a flu. So it happens. But when you are in this business for a long time, you develop a kind of sixth sense. You fall asleep only when the stuff that's coming up is irrelevant. He knew a lot about Pavlov, so he did Pavlov's example of the waking point, when you have the cortical inhibition, the waking point. And Pavlov's example is a mother who can sleep through heavy noises, but when the child starts moaning, she wakes up, it's right there. So it's just like the mother, you just wake up and you're right there. So then I realized there was a problem, because what is relevant, what isn't relevant, depends on the kind of training you have, depends on the school. What's relevant for a Freudian is not necessarily relevant for a Jungian or for somebody who's trained by Karen Horney and so on.